Virginia, August 1943. The Atlantic crossing was over, but none of the men believed the worst was behind them. Inside the steel belly of the ship, German prisoners of war stood shoulder to shoulder, swaying as the vessel groaned against the dock at Norfolk. 14 days at sea had drained their strength, but fear kept them upright. Every man aboard had been prepared for what awaited them on American soil, or so they believed. They had seen the films, they had heard the warnings. According to everything they had been taught, the United States was brutal, chaotic, and cruel. American soldiers were supposed to torture prisoners, starve them, humiliate them. Surrender, they were told, was worse than death. Nazi propaganda had repeated it endlessly. German prisoners of war captured by the Americans would never return. That certainty felt solid until the gangplank lowered. At exactly 6 a.m., the first prisoners stepped onto the dock. Corporal Klaus Muller was among them. His legs trembled, not from weakness, but anticipation. He braced himself for the first blow, the first scream, the moment when captivity would become punishment. None of it came. An American military policeman stood at the base of the ramp, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He did not shout, he did not strike. He checked his watch and yawned like a man beginning an ordinary shift. Another guard nearby laughed at a joke Klaus could not understand. No one moved aggressively. No one raised a weapon. The silence was unsettling. Klaus inhaled deeply and froze. The air smelled alive. Salt, warmth, vegetation, not smoke, not ash. Beyond the dock stretched a landscape untouched by war. Green trees, intact buildings, blue sky reflected in clean windows. Warehouses stood whole, cranes lifted cargo, workers called to one another across the port. This was a wartime harbor, but it looked like peace. Beside Klaus, another prisoner whispered in disbelief. "The buildings, they are not bombed." He was right. In Germany, cities were burning. Hamburg, Cologne, Stuttgart, reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Here, in Norfolk, Virginia, nothing burned at all. The contrast was violent in its own way. It cracked something deep in the men who saw it. The prisoners were guided forward, still expecting interrogation, still waiting for cruelty to reveal itself. Instead, they were handed paperwork. Names were checked against lists, fingers were inked, photographs were taken. No threats, no violence, just bureaucracy. Klaus became a number, another prisoner in a long line, and even that felt wrong. The American clerk spoke accented German. His tone was tired, indifferent, not hostile, like a man who wanted his coffee more than obedience. Then came the trains. Klaus expected boxcars, cattle cars, the kind he had ridden to the front, 50 men, no seats, no air, a bucket in the corner. What waited on the tracks shattered that expectation completely. Passenger cars, Pullman cars, clean windows, cushioned seats, overhead racks. An American guard gestured inside and said something Klaus didn't understand, but his voice wasn't cruel. Inside, the seats were fabric-covered, faded blue, but soft. Klaus sat down slowly, afraid the illusion would vanish. The train smelled clean. Fresh air flowed through open windows. Around him, men stared in silence. "They are putting us on a passenger train," someone whispered. As the train pulled away from the dock, Virginia rolled past in green waves, farms untouched by tanks, houses standing whole, children playing near the tracks. One child waved. Klaus waved back before he could stop himself. Every mile carried him deeper into a country that did not match the enemy he had been taught to hate. The United States, the land of supposed barbarism, revealed abundance instead. Fields instead of ruins, food instead of ration lines, calm instead of chaos. By the time the train crossed into the American South, certainty had begun to crumble. The men had arrived expecting hell. What they found instead was something far more dangerous to the ideology they carried with them: normality. And this was only the first day. The train slowed as the sun sank lower in the sky. After hours rolling through fields and small towns, the landscape began to change. The green stretched wider. The air grew heavier. Humidity pressed against the windows as if the land itself were breathing. When the train finally stopped, the heat wrapped around the prisoners like a blanket. A sign stood near the platform: Camp Hearne, Texas. Klaus Mueller stepped down onto gravel and instinctively scanned for weapons, dogs, shouting officers, anything that matched what he had been prepared for. Instead, he saw order, new wooden buildings, guard towers placed with precision, barbed wire catching the late afternoon light. It was clearly a prison camp, and yet something about it felt wrong. American soldiers waited to receive them, but their posture puzzled Klaus. Rifles remained slung. No one barked commands. One sergeant helped an older prisoner down from the train, steadying him by the elbow when he stumbled. The gesture was automatic, unremarkable, and deeply unsettling. This was not how guards were supposed to behave toward enemies. Processing began immediately. More forms, more photographs, then medical examinations. Klaus was directed into a wooden building and told to remove his shirt. He expected humiliation. What he received was concern. An American doctor examined his chest, his eyes, his ears, and paused at an old shrapnel wound on Klaus's shoulder. "This should have had stitches," the doctor said in careful German. He cleaned the wound, applied fresh bandages, and made a note on a chart. "Report to the infirmary tomorrow." Klaus stood there in silence, shirtless, receiving better medical care than he had received in 2 years on the Eastern Front. As a German prisoner of war, he was being treated like a patient, not an enemy. Outside, twilight settled over the camp. The prisoners were divided into groups and led toward the barracks. Klaus followed, his mind struggling to keep up with reality. The buildings were long and low, newly constructed, with screened windows and wooden steps. The door stood open. Inside, everything stopped. Beds. Real beds. Metal frames, mattresses, sheets, pillows. The room smelled of fresh pine and disinfectant. No dirt floor, no concrete, no straw. Otto, walking behind Klaus, made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "They gave us beds," he whispered. Men froze at the doorway. Some reached out to touch the sheets, afraid they would disappear. Others sat down slowly, like children testing ice. One older sergeant sank onto his bunk and covered his face with his hands, shaking. Klaus sat on the nearest bed and felt the mattress compress beneath him. Springs creaked softly. He ran his hand over the sheet. It was thin, institutional, but clean. A folded blanket rested at the foot of the bed. A pillow waited at the head. He lay back and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he was not lying on dirt, metal, or frozen ground. A whistle blew. Dinner time. They walked to the mess hall in loose formation. The building was larger than Klaus expected, with long tables and benches. American soldiers sat at some tables, eating and talking casually. The prisoners were directed to their own section, not separated by walls or guards, just space. The serving line began. Behind the counter, American cooks in white aprons ladled food onto metal trays. Real cooks, not prisoners, not forced labor. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes with brown gravy, green beans, white bread with butter, cold milk. Klaus carried his tray to the table and sat down. He stared at the food. Otto sat beside him, Friedrich across from them. None of them moved. "This isn't real," Otto finally said. Klaus cut into the chicken. Steam rose. He took a bite.
It was the best food he had eaten in years, better than the front, better than the Wehrmacht rations, better than anything his family was eating back in Germany. Around him, hundreds of German POWs in the United States came to the same realization at the same time. The mess hall filled with the sound of eating, slow, stunned eating. One older man stared at his untouched tray. "My daughter is 11, he quietly said. In her last letter, she wrote they had soup, only soup. His hands trembled as he picked up his fork. That night, Klaus stood under a shower and felt hot water run over his skin. Real hot water. He leaned his forehead against the tile and shook, unable to stop. By the time lights went out, the camp settled into an unfamiliar silence. Not the silence of fear, the silence of disbelief. The men had been prepared for cruelty. They had braced themselves for starvation and punishment in American POW camps. Instead, they were fed, healed, given beds. And lying awake in the dark, Klaus understood something that frightened him more than guards or barbed wire ever could. If everything he had been told about American treatment of German POWs in World War II was a lie, then what else had been a lie?
August turned into September, and the Texas heat did not break. For Klaus Müller and the other German prisoners of war, life inside Camp Hearne settled into a routine that felt impossible to reconcile with the word captivity. Mornings began with roll call. Breakfast followed. Then came the question that quietly divided the camp. Who wanted to work? The War Department followed the Geneva Convention closely. Prisoners could not be forced into labor, but they could volunteer. Farms across the American South were desperate for hands. Most young American men were overseas, fighting in Europe and the Pacific. Cotton fields stretched farther than the eye could see, unattended. Volunteering meant leaving the barbed wire each morning. It also meant something else, exposure to America beyond the fences. Klaus signed up without hesitation. Anything was better than waiting, better than thinking. The trucks arrived just after dawn, engines rumbling as guards called names. Rifles stayed slung. No dogs, no shouting. The prisoners climbed into the truck beds and were driven down narrow farm roads past fields glowing white under the rising sun. Their destination was a cotton farm owned by a man named Curtis Whitfield. Curtis stood waiting at the edge of the field, hat pulled low against the glare. He studied the prisoners with eyes shaped by droughts and failed harvests, not ideology. When he spoke, his voice carried no anger. "You boys ever picked cotton?" None of them had. Curtis showed them how to pull the boll without tearing it, how to work a row without crushing the plants, how to move steadily so the heat didn't steal your strength too quickly. The work was hard. Backs ached, sweat soaked uniforms, but there was rhythm in it, a strange peace after years of explosions and commands. At noon, a pickup truck rolled toward the field. Curtis's wife climbed out, carrying baskets and thermoses. Klaus expected to eat separately, under guard. Instead, Curtis waved everyone toward the shade of a live oak. "Come on," he said. "Food's getting cold." They sat together, Germans and Americans, prisoners and guards. Curtis's wife handed out sandwiches thick with ham and cheese, pickles, potato chips, and lemonade so cold it made Klaus wince. He drank 3 glasses. No one stopped him. No one stared. This was not propaganda. This was not theater. This was a woman serving lunch to men her country was fighting overseas. One of Curtis's sons was in France, wearing an American uniform, facing German soldiers. Klaus knew this. Curtis said it plainly. "My boy's over there," Curtis said, chewing slowly. "Reckon he's fighting men like you." Klaus swallowed hard. "I am sorry," he said in broken English. Curtis shrugged. "Wars are wars.
Politicians start 'em, young men die in 'em. Been that way since Cain and Abel. That sentence followed Klaus back to the camp. So did the lemonade. The workdays continued. Prisoners earned money, not cash, but camp script, usable at the canteen. Cigarettes, chocolate, soap, small luxuries that felt unreal. Some locals complained. Newspapers printed angry letters about enemy soldiers eating better than American civilians under rationing. The prisoners heard the nickname whispered outside the fence, the Fritz Ritz. Inside the camp, evenings brought more surprises. Classes were offered: English, mathematics, agriculture. No forced attendance, no slogans, no political lectures, just instruction. Some prisoners dismissed it as American manipulation. Others enrolled immediately. Friedrich, who had studied philosophy before the war, took every class he could. Otto focused on English. His teacher was Mrs. Campbell, a retired school teacher from Houston. She corrected pronunciation patiently, praised progress sincerely, and brought books and newspapers. Otto read about the war from the other side. He read about American production numbers, factories producing planes and tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. He read about cities that were not starving, about a country that did not resemble the collapsing empire he'd been told about. The contradiction grew heavier each day. Guards played cards with prisoners, shared cigarettes, talked about baseball and farms and weather, treated German POWs in the United States not as monsters, but as men. And yet, the war had not fully loosened its grip. Some prisoners refused to accept what they saw. Hard-line Nazis enforced loyalty in secret. They watched who learned English too well, who laughed too easily with guards, who seemed to forget the Reich. When a prisoner named Hugo Kraus openly criticized Hitler and cooperated with American authorities, the violence followed. He was beaten with pipes and boards in the night. He died days later. The shock marked the camp. American officers separated the radicals, increased supervision, but the message lingered. Even here, surrounded by abundance, ideology could still kill. For Klaus, the lesson cut deep. America was not perfect, it was not innocent, but it was not the enemy he'd been trained to imagine. Each day of fair treatment, each shared meal, each class and paycheck cracked the certainty he'd carried across the ocean. Nazism had promised strength. What he found instead was dignity, offered freely, without conditions, and that was something no propaganda film had prepared him for.
By winter, the camp no longer felt temporary. Camp Hearne had developed its own rhythm, mornings measured by whistles, evenings softened by routine. The Texas heat faded into cool nights, jackets appeared, steam rose from coffee cups. For many German prisoners of war, captivity had stopped feeling like a pause and begun to feel like a parallel life. That was when the war returned, not with bombs or gunfire, but with whispers. Inside the barracks, invisible lines hardened. Men who learned English too quickly were watched. Men who volunteered too often for farm work were questioned. Men who spoke openly about Hitler, about defeat, about lies, were marked. Nazism had crossed the Atlantic inside their heads. The ideology that promised unity now demanded silence. Prisoners formed secret circles, enforcing loyalty with intimidation. They reminded others that the Reich was eternal, that Germany would still win, that kindness from Americans was deception, weakness disguised as generosity. Most ignored them. Some feared them. Hugo Kraus did neither. Hugo spoke English fluently. He served as an interpreter for American guards. He openly criticized the Third Reich and warned officers about violent extremists inside the camp. To men still clinging to ideology, that made him a traitor. One night, pipes and boards were raised in the dark.
The beating was savage. By morning, Hugo lay broken, his skull cracked, his arms shattered. He died days later in the infirmary, surrounded by the same American medical staff who had tried to save him. No one intervened. Fear still had teeth. The murder shattered any illusion that captivity had erased the war. American authorities responded quickly, separating radical prisoners, increasing surveillance, enforcing discipline. But for Klaus Müller, the damage was already done. Even here, surrounded by food, beds, and dignity, ideology could still kill. Weeks later, letters began arriving. Thin envelopes, delayed by months. Some never arrived at all. Klaus received one from his mother. Hamburg had burned. Stuttgart lay in ruins. Their home was gone. His sister was alive. Food was scarce. Work was scarce. The future was fog. He read the letter sitting on his bunk, the same bunk with clean sheets and a pillow he still could not fully accept as real. Around him, other prisoners read similar letters, some weeping openly, others folding the pages with mechanical calm. Guilt spread quietly. They were safe, fed, warm. Their families were not. The contradiction became unbearable for some. Men skipped meals. Others grew angry, snapping at guards who had shown them nothing but fairness. A few withdrew completely, unable to reconcile abundance in captivity with starvation at home. Then, in May 1945, the war ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead. The announcement reached the camp through radios, newspapers, and the International Red Cross. Prisoners gathered in silence, listening to reports of devastation. Cities flattened, millions dead, a country erased and reborn in ruins. For the Allies, it was victory. For the prisoners, it was confirmation. Nazism had failed. And yet, captivity continued. President Truman's decision was practical. Farms still needed hands. Factories were transitioning from war to peace. Repatriation would take time. The German POWs in the United States remained, working, waiting, living between worlds. It was during this waiting that the question surfaced: what comes after? Curtis Whitfield asked it one afternoon in the cotton fields. The sun hung heavy overhead as Klaus wiped sweat from his brow. "You ever think about staying after the war?" Curtis said casually. The words landed harder than any blow. Staying meant abandoning ruins, abandoning guilt, abandoning the land that had raised him, but also the ideology that had betrayed him. It meant choosing a country that had imprisoned him and treated him with more dignity than his own government ever had. Klaus did not answer. Others had. Some prisoners dreamed openly of returning to America as immigrants. Teachers encouraged it. Farmers offered letters of recommendation. Guards spoke of visas and opportunity, a life built instead of destroyed. Others clung desperately to Germany, no matter what remained of it. The camp divided again, not by ideology this time, but by hope. By the summer of 1946, repatriation began. Ships crossed the Atlantic, carrying men back to a homeland that no longer existed as memory remembered it. Klaus's name appeared on a list. Departure, August 1946. On his final day of farm work, Curtis drove him one last time through the fields. They worked in silence. At lunch, Curtis's wife served fried chicken, the same meal Klaus had eaten on his first day in Texas. "You change your mind," Curtis said quietly. "You write me, I'll help." They shook hands at the gate, a farmer and a former enemy. That night, Klaus packed his belongings, few but heavy with meaning. As he lay in his bunk for the last time,
He understood something with painful clarity. The war had not ended when Germany surrendered. It ended one belief at a time. And the hardest battle of all was deciding which country he truly belonged to now.
The ship that carried Klaus Müller back across the Atlantic bore no resemblance to the train that had brought him into America. There were no cushioned seats, no open windows, no sense of ease. The crossing was slow, cold, and crowded. Men slept shoulder to shoulder on metal decks, wrapped in thin blankets, seasick and silent. The ocean felt wider on the way back, heavier, as if it knew what waited on the other side. When the ship finally docked at Bremerhaven in September 1946, Klaus stepped onto German soil and stopped. The port was a skeleton. Cranes stood twisted, warehouses were gutted, smoke-stained walls leaned at impossible angles. The city beyond was worse, blocks of rubble stretching in every direction as far as the eye could see. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed, dressed in patched clothing that barely held together. This was not defeat. This was erasure. Klaus boarded a train toward Stuttgart, not a passenger car, a boxcar, packed with returnees, former soldiers, prisoners, displaced men, all silent. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. As the train creaked forward, Klaus felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He had ridden trains like this before, but this time there was no illusion of purpose, only exhaustion. Stuttgart no longer existed as a city. Landmarks from his childhood were gone. Streets ended in craters. Buildings he once knew by name had vanished entirely. His family home was a hole in the ground, marked only by broken brick and blackened stone. He found his mother and sister 15 kilometers outside the city, living in a single room on a farm owned by distant relatives. They held each other and cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet release of people who had held grief too long. That night, his mother made soup, potatoes, carrots, water. It was thin, barely seasoned, but it was home. Klaus ate slowly, every bite a reminder. In Texas, he had eaten fried chicken, fresh bread, butter, milk. As a German prisoner of war in the United States, he had known abundance. Here, as a free man in his own country, there was hunger. His sister asked the question everyone asked. What was it like? In America? In the camps? Klaus stared at the bowl in his hands. How could he explain abundance to people who had lived on ration cards and ruins? How could he describe clean beds to a family that slept in borrowed space? How could he speak of lemonade offered by strangers to people who lined up for watery soup? It was not what we were told, he said finally. None of it. The words felt small, insufficient. In the months that followed, Klaus worked construction, clearing rubble, laying bricks, rebuilding walls that barely held. Germany moved forward inch by inch, scar by scar, but something in him remained displaced. At night, memories returned uninvited. Texas skies, cotton fields stretching to the horizon, Curtis Whitfield's steady voice, Mrs. Campbell correcting his English, guards sharing cigarettes, beds with sheets, showers with hot water. He felt guilt for remembering, but he could not stop. Letters began to arrive from former campmates. Otto had stayed longer, then returned briefly, then left again. Friedrich wrote about finishing his education in America. Others spoke of visas, of work, of building instead of repairing ruins. Klaus resisted the idea at first. Leaving felt like betrayal, but staying felt like suffocation. Germany was rebuilding, yes, but slowly, painfully, with shortages and bitterness lingering everywhere. The war was over, yet its shadow stretched long.
Conversations stopped abruptly. Eyes looked away. Everyone carried loss, but no one knew what to do with it. In America, Klaus remembered something different. Not innocence, not perfection, but possibility. In 1953, he filled out the paperwork. The application took years. Interviews, background checks, questions about loyalty, work, character. When the visa finally arrived in 1955, Klaus held it in his hands and felt the same disbelief he had felt the first night at Camp Hearne. Once again, reality contradicted expectation. He brought his family with him. Texas welcomed them, not as prisoners this time, but as immigrants. Klaus worked farms again, then construction. He built a house that stayed standing, raised children under a wide sky that did not burn. He was not alone. Thousands of former German POWs in the United States returned after the war, men who crossed the ocean expecting cruelty and found dignity instead. Men whose understanding of America had been rewritten not by propaganda, but by experience. Years later, when asked what defeated Nazism for him, Klaus did not mention bombs or armies. He mentioned beds, food, fairness. He mentioned a country that fed its enemies when it did not have to. And standing in his own kitchen in Texas, decades after captivity, Klaus understood the full weight of what he had been given. America had not just imprisoned him, it had shown him another way to live.
What happened to Klaus Müller was not an exception, it was a pattern. By the end of World War II, the United States had held more than 400,000 German prisoners of war across hundreds of camps. From Texas to Arizona, from the Midwest to the East Coast, German POWs in the United States lived behind barbed wire that was real, but whose purpose was containment, not punishment. For decades after the war, historians would struggle to describe what the American POW system actually was. It was not mercy, it was not charity, and it was not accidental. The U.S. War Department understood something most regimes at war did not. How prisoners were treated would shape the world after victory. Food, labor, education, medical care, all of it followed the Geneva Convention not only because it was law, but because it was strategy. Not re-education by force, re-education by example. American POW camps became controlled environments where ideology faced reality every day. Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as decadent, violent, collapsing. What prisoners encountered instead was abundance, organization, and routine normalcy. Farms producing more food than Germany could imagine. Factories untouched by bombing. Civilians living without fear of air raids. The contradiction was relentless. Prisoners ate 3 meals a day. They slept in beds. They received medical care. They earned pay for their labor. They attended classes. They read newspapers from multiple perspectives. They worked beside Americans whose sons were fighting in Europe and who still shared lemonade under a tree. This did not turn every prisoner into a Democrat. Some resisted until the end. But for many, it did something far more powerful than persuasion. It made lies impossible to maintain. Post-war studies revealed that thousands of former German prisoners voluntarily returned to the United States after repatriation. They applied for visas, found work, married, started businesses, built lives in the same country they had been taught to despise. Otto Wehrer opened a bakery in Houston. Friedrich Hahn completed his philosophy degree and taught for decades. Former POWs became farmers, mechanics, teachers, engineers. Entire communities in Texas and the Midwest quietly absorbed men who had once worn enemy uniforms. This phenomenon stunned European observers. How could men who had been imprisoned choose to return?
The answer was uncomfortable for ideologues on both sides, because captivity had not been defined by humiliation, it had been defined by dignity. Historians now widely agree that the American POW program was one of the most successful ideological defeats of Nazism, not because of lectures, but because of lived experience. The system did not demand loyalty, it offered contrast. It did not force belief, it exposed falsehood. Nazi ideology depended on dehumanization. It required enemies to be monsters. Once those enemies became people, people who fed you, taught you, healed you, and treated you as human, the ideology collapsed under its own weight. Even the internal violence inside camps reinforced this truth. When radical prisoners murdered Hugo Kraus, American authorities responded decisively, separating extremists and protecting moderates. The message was clear: violence would not be tolerated, even among prisoners. Justice applied evenly. That mattered. Years later, historians reviewing letters, diaries, and interviews found a common refrain among former German POWs. They did not describe conversion, they described awakening. One former prisoner wrote, "We were trained to believe Americans were weak and immoral. Then we lived among them. The contradiction destroyed everything we had been taught." Another said, "I was captured expecting death. Instead, I was given a bed and asked to work. That confused me more than violence ever could." The program did not erase guilt. Many former prisoners carried lifelong remorse for the regime they had served, but it gave them something else, a way forward that did not require hatred. For the United States, the impact was subtle but lasting. The men who returned as immigrants became bridges between worlds. They raised American children with German memories. They told stories not of torture, but of unexpected fairness during war. For Germany, the effect was quieter. These men returned changed. They rebuilt not only cities, but values. They questioned authority. They resisted absolutes. They remembered a time when enemies chose decency. This is why historians argue that the treatment of German prisoners of war in American POW camps achieved something bombs never could. It broke belief, not through fear, not through force, but through contradiction so complete that lies could no longer survive it. Nazism promised strength through cruelty. America answered with something the ideology could not counter: normal life. And in the long arc of history, that proved far more destructive to extremism than any battlefield victory.
Klaus Müller returned to Texas for the first time in 1968. He was no longer a prisoner, no longer young, no longer uncertain about who he was. The road was paved now. The town had grown. Gas stations stood where fields once stretched uninterrupted to the horizon. But when he stepped out of his car and felt the heat settle on his shoulders, something tightened in his chest. The sky was still wide, too wide to forget. Camp Hearne was gone. The barracks had been dismantled years earlier, some sold for scrap, others repurposed into sheds and barns. The guard towers had vanished. The wire was gone. Only a small marker remained, modest, almost apologetic, noting that German prisoners of war had once lived and worked there. Klaus stood in front of it longer than he expected. 3 years of his life had unfolded on that ground. 3 years that had reshaped everything he believed about power, enemies, and truth. Around him, cars passed without slowing. Children laughed somewhere nearby. Life continued, indifferent to memory. That was the point. America had never asked him to remember. It had simply shown him how people lived when bombs were not falling. Across the state and across the country, thousands of former German POWs in the United States carried similar memories.
Some returned as immigrants. Others stayed in Europe, but never forgot what captivity had taught them. Their stories rarely made headlines. They did not fit clean narratives of good and evil. They complicated things. Historians later struggled with that complication. War, after all, is easier to explain in absolutes, heroes and villains, victors and defeated. But the American POW camps refused to fit that frame. They were not humane because Americans were saints. They were humane because systems were built to be so. Rules mattered. Oversight mattered. Accountability mattered. The Geneva Convention was not an abstract document. It was enforced daily, quietly, without spectacle. Abuse was punished. Extremism was contained. Routine replaced chaos. And routine changes people. Former prisoners described the same moments again and again in interviews decades later. Not grand gestures, but small, disarming ones. A guard sharing cigarettes. A doctor treating an old wound carefully. A teacher correcting grammar without ridicule. A farmer offering lemonade under a tree. Those moments did not erase guilt. They did not absolve crimes, but they destroyed the lie that cruelty was strength. Nazism depended on a simple equation: the enemy is less than human. Once that equation failed, everything built on it collapsed. This is why historians argue that the treatment of German prisoners of war in American POW camps did something armies could not. It created cognitive dissonance so sustained that ideology could not survive it. Not overnight, but inevitably. Former prisoners returned to Germany carrying this contradiction with them. They rebuilt cities with hands that remembered cotton fields. They raised children who would question authority instead of worship it. They distrusted slogans. They distrusted absolutes. Some spoke openly, others never spoke at all, but the lesson stayed. Even decades later, interviews revealed the same quiet acknowledgement. "We were told America was barbaric," one former prisoner said. "Then we lived there. The lie couldn't survive daily life." Another put it more simply: "They defeated us without hating us." For Klaus, the memory crystallized years after his return, standing at a grocery store in Texas, watching shelves overflow with food. Not because abundance impressed him anymore, but because he understood what it represented: stability, trust, systems that worked even when men failed. He had seen what happened when ideology replaced reality. He had lived inside its consequences, and he had experienced something rarer, a victory that did not require humiliation. When Klaus eventually spoke to students in the 1980s, he did not lecture about politics. He did not excuse himself or his generation. He told one story. "On my first day in America, I expected to be shot. Instead, I was given a pillow." The students laughed softly, unsure how to respond. "That confusion," Klaus continued, "took me the rest of my life to understand. Because war teaches men how to destroy, but captivity, when handled with restraint, can teach them something far more dangerous to extremism: how to doubt." The camps are gone now. The fences are gone. The uniforms are museum pieces. But scattered across Texas fields and American towns, in letters, photographs, and family stories, the legacy remains. Men crossed an ocean expecting death. They found routine. They found dignity. They found a second chance to choose what kind of people they would be after the war ended. That was America's quiet victory. Not written in treaties, not celebrated in parades, but lived: one bed, one meal, one act of ordinary decency at a time.
History often remembers wars through numbers. Battles won, cities destroyed, lives lost. But some of the most decisive victories never appear on maps or timelines. They unfold quietly, inside ordinary moments, moments that undermine belief instead of enforcing it. For the German prisoners who arrived in the United States during World War II, the collapse did not begin with defeat on the battlefield. It began with contradiction. They crossed the Atlantic prepared for cruelty, prepared for starvation, prepared for humiliation. Everything they had been taught told them that surrender to America meant the end of dignity. Instead, they were processed without violence, fed without bargaining, healed without hatred, given beds, given work, given routine. Not because they deserved it, but because systems were built to function without vengeance. For many of them, that was harder to face than brutality would have been. Violence would have confirmed the lie. Kindness exposed it. And once exposed, it could not be unseen. This is why historians studying German prisoners of war in the United States often describe the American POW program not as a moral gesture, but as a strategic one. It followed the Geneva Convention not as theater, but as policy. It allowed ideology to confront reality daily and lose. Nazism promised strength through domination. America answered with order without cruelty. The result was not instant conversion. It was something slower, deeper, and far more durable: doubt. Doubt grows quietly. It spreads in routine. It survives long after uniforms are folded away. Years later, when former prisoners returned to Germany or chose to immigrate back to the United States, they carried that doubt with them. It shaped how they raised children, how they viewed authority, how they remembered power. They did not forget their guilt. They did not excuse their past, but they learned something their ideology had tried desperately to prevent them from learning. Enemies can be human. And when that belief takes root, extremism loses its foundation. The camps are gone now, the fences dismantled, the barracks torn down. What remains are small markers in open fields and fragments of memory in archives, letters, and interviews, and stories like this one. Historical note and transparency. Before we end, one clarification matters. This video is based on documented historical events, records, and testimony regarding the treatment of German prisoners of war in American POW camps during World War II. But however, some characters are composite figures representing the experiences of many real prisoners. Certain dialogues and personal moments are dramatized to convey emotional and historical truth. No verbatim conversations from camps were recorded, so specific lines are reconstructions, not transcripts. The events, conditions, and outcomes described are historically accurate. The storytelling format is used to make them understandable and human. This distinction matters because honesty matters. In later interviews, one former prisoner summarized the experience with a sentence historians still quote today: "We were trained to believe Americans were monsters. Then they fed us, healed us, and treated us with respect we did not expect. That broke the ideology more effectively than bombs ever could." Another put it even simpler: "On my first day in America, I expected to be shot. Instead, I was given a pillow." Understanding that contradiction took a lifetime. And perhaps that is the final lesson of this story. Violence can force obedience. Fear can demand silence, but only dignity can dismantle belief. If this story made you think,
If it challenged what you thought you knew about war, enemies, or history, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we choose to understand from it. And sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't force at all. It's truth lived quietly, one ordinary human moment at a time.